You need to leave now.
Why?
Look at her. What did she do? Get up. You're leaving.
At 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, a single moment had the power to unravel everything. When Maya Johnson settled into Seat 2A of the first class cabin aboard Transatlantic Airways Flight 714, she was not thinking about power or politics or the quiet machinery of prejudice that had followed her entire life. She was thinking about how far she had come. She was thinking about the glass of sparkling water the flight attendant had just handed her without being asked, about the way the leather seat seemed to exhale beneath her weight, about how the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and something expensive she could not name. She was thinking that for the first time in 32 years, she had given herself permission to stop running, stop proving, stop fighting, even if only for the 8 hours it would take to cross the ocean and land back home in New York. Outside the oval window, the sky above Heathrow was the flat pale gray of an English afternoon, and the aircraft sat motionless on the tarmac with the quiet confidence of a machine waiting to do what it was built to do. Maya had worked toward this moment for a very long time. Not this seat, specifically, not this aircraft, but the version of herself that felt entitled to take it without apology. But none of those thoughts would last, because before the aircraft ever left the ground, an air marshal in a dark jacket would walk down that aisle and demand she leave. Passengers would stare. A flight attendant would look away. Someone near the back of the cabin would actually applaud. And what no one aboard that aircraft understood, not the air marshal, not the passengers with their raised eyebrows and their quiet assumptions, not the airline's own staff, was that the woman they were humiliating had a father. And that father was about to make a phone call that would shake the entire aviation industry to its foundation. Maya Johnson had not been handed a single thing in her life. That was the truth she carried with her everywhere. The kind of truth that does not announce itself but lives in the way a person holds their chin when they walk into a room where they are not expected. She had grown up in the East Side neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, in a two-bedroom apartment where the radiator knocked every winter and the windows sweated in the summer heat that rolled in off the flat Midwestern plains. The building had a superintendent named Mr. Greer, who fixed things slowly, and a parking lot that flooded when it rained, and a community of neighbors who looked out for one another in the practical, unannounced way of people who understood that looking out was a form of survival. Her mother, Diane, was a registered nurse who worked double shifts at St. Anthony's Hospital and still found time on Sunday mornings to press Maya's church dress with a hot iron, humming gospel songs in the kitchen while coffee brewed on the stovetop. Diane Johnson was the kind of woman who believed deeply in two things: God, and the idea that her daughter would one day walk through doors that had never been opened for anyone in their family. Maya's father had left when she was 4 years old. She had no clear memory of his face, only a vague impression of a tall shadow in a doorway, a voice that sounded like thunder from somewhere far away, and then nothing. For most of her childhood and all of her teenage years, she had believed he simply did not want her. That belief, quiet and corrosive, had shaped the way she worked, harder than anyone expected, longer than anyone asked, and always with something to prove that she could never fully name. She had won a full scholarship to Ohio State University, studying computer science when there were only a handful of women in the program and even fewer black women. She had graduated summa cum laude and turned down two corporate job offers to build something of her own, a tech startup focused on supply chain automation software that, within 4 years, had grown from a two-person operation in her studio apartment into a company with 60 employees and clients on 3 continents. By the time she was 32, Maya Johnson was the kind of woman whose name appeared in the business sections of major newspapers, whose keynote invitations arrived from conferences in Berlin, Singapore, and Sao Paulo, and whose net worth had recently cleared 8 figures for the first time. She had not told many people that. She dressed simply, drove a sensible car, and still called her mother every Sunday morning, even when she was traveling. The trip to London had been a turning point. For 18 months, Maya had been quietly negotiating the acquisition of a British logistics firm called Meridian Pathways, a deal that, once finalized, would expand her company's reach across the European Union and position her as one of the most significant players in her sector on either side of the Atlantic. The negotiations had been brutal. There had been moments when she was certain the deal would fall apart: a disagreement over equity structure in December, a regulatory complication in February, a personality clash with one of Meridian's senior partners that had nearly derailed everything in March. But she had held on, adjusted her approach, found the leverage where others had given up, and 3 days ago, she had sat in a wood-paneled conference room in Mayfair and signed the final papers. The deal was worth approximately $140 million. It was the largest transaction of her career, and as she rode in the hired car to Heathrow Airport the following morning, Maya had done something she almost never did. She had booked herself a first-class seat. It was an indulgence, she told herself, and immediately felt guilty for calling it that. She had earned this. She had built something from nothing, from a radiator that knocked, and a mother who hummed gospel songs, and a father who left. And she had turned it into $140 million and a seat at a table that nobody has sat for her. The first-class ticket cost $4,200. She paid without flinching. She had worked for exactly this. And as she walked through the dedicated check-in lane at Heathrow, boarding pass in hand, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a white silk blouse, and carrying the leather laptop bag she had bought herself the year her company first crossed $1 million in revenue, Maya Johnson felt, for the first time, in a long time, like she had finally arrived somewhere. The first-class cabin of Transatlantic Airways was arranged in a herringbone configuration, 14 seats, each with its own pod, privacy screen, and a small panel of controls that adjusted lighting, temperature, and the angle of the seat with the gentleness of a luxury hotel. Maya found her seat, stowed her bag in the overhead compartment with the confident ease of someone who had been traveling for business for years, and settled in. She accepted the sparkling water. She glanced at the menu tucked into the side pocket. She opened her laptop briefly to send one final email confirming the closing of the Meridian deal, then closed it and allowed herself to simply sit. She had been seated no more than 10 minutes when she first noticed the looks. Not all of them were hostile. Some were merely curious. The casual, half-registered surprise of people encountering something slightly unexpected in a space they considered predictable. But a few carried something sharper. The man across the aisle from her heavy-set, middle-aged, wearing a pale blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to the elbow, had looked at her when she sat down with an expression that lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long. It was not a look she could easily describe to someone who had never experienced it, but she recognized it with the automatic clarity of long practice. It was the look that said, "Are you sure you belong here?" Maya had been receiving that look since she was 12 years old, the first time she had walked into the gifted program classroom at her middle school and found that everyone else was white. She had learned, over 20 years, to absorb it without reaction, to let it pass through her like a cold draft through a window she had long since sealed. The flight attendant who came to confirm her meal selection was young, blonde, and professionally pleasant. She checked Maya's boarding pass, which was entirely normal, and then, 3 minutes later, came back to check it again. Maya noticed. She also noticed that the man across the aisle had not had his boarding pass checked at all, nor had the two women seated ahead of her, nor the gray-haired gentleman in seat 1A who had boarded before her and immediately fallen asleep beneath a blanket without anyone asking to verify his documentation. The second check was performed quietly, with an apologetic half-smile that Maya recognized as the specific expression people wore when they were doing something they knew was wrong, but were doing it anyway. She handed over her boarding pass without comment. Everything was in order, as it always was. The flight attendant thanked her and moved on. Maya turned back to the window and watched the baggage handlers move across the tarmac in their yellow vests, and she told herself what she had been telling herself for 20 years. It does not matter. You are here. You have every right to be here. Let it go. The announcement came over the intercom that the aircraft would begin boarding final stragglers and prepare for pushback within 20 minutes. Maya accepted a warm towel from another attendant. She exhaled slowly and reached for her noise-canceling headphones. And that was when she saw him. He appeared at the forward entrance of the first-class cabin, a broad-shouldered man in a dark charcoal jacket, with the particular posture of someone trained to project authority in confined spaces. He was not in uniform, but there was something about the way he moved unhurried, deliberate, scanning the cabin with eyes that missed nothing that immediately identified him as a person carrying institutional weight. His name, Maya would later learn, was Agent Roy Callahan. He had been a federal air marshal for 11 years. He had a record that was, on paper, unremarkable meaning. No significant commendations, and no significant disciplinary actions. The career profile of someone who had never been tested in either direction in any meaningful way. He walked to the midpoint of the first-class cabin and stopped. He looked directly at Maya. Then he took 2 more steps toward her and said, in a voice calibrated to be heard by her, but not necessarily by the entire cabin, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Maya looked up at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I need you to come with me," he repeated. "There's a security concern." The words were ordinary, but the context transformed them into something else entirely. Maya felt her stomach drop not from fear, but from a recognition so familiar it was almost exhausting. "What kind of security concern?" she asked. Her voice was level. She had spent her entire career learning to make her voice level. Agent Callahan said, "I'm not able to discuss that here. Please gather your belongings." Maya did not move. "I have a valid ticket," she said. "I'd like to know why I'm being asked to leave my seat before I do anything." The cabin had gone quiet around them. She could feel it, the shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when a group of strangers collectively decides to watch something rather than ignore it. A passenger 2 rows back had already lifted a phone. Another had turned entirely in their seat. The man across the aisle, the one in the pale blue dress shirt, wore an expression of alert, almost hungry attention, the look of someone who believed they were about to see a suspicion confirmed. The flight attendant who had checked Maya's boarding pass twice stood near the galley curtain and did not move and did not speak. Agent Callahan said, "Ma'am, I'm asking you to cooperate." Maya said, "I am cooperating. I'm asking a legal question. You're asking me to leave a seat I have paid for and have a valid ticket for. I would like to know the basis for that request." Callahan took a breath. He was not accustomed to being questioned, not because he was unreasonable by nature, but because in 11 years he had never been questioned. "We have received a concern," he said, choosing the word with care, "regarding your presence in this cabin." The sentence was extraordinary in its vagueness. It was also, in its vagueness, revealing. Maya heard it clearly. A concern, not a threat, not a credible report, not a flagged document or a watch list alert. A concern from someone about her presence in first class. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands when they are choosing to comply, not because they have surrendered, but because they have decided that the fight will be better fought on different ground. She took her laptop bag from the overhead compartment. She looked at Agent Callahan for a long moment without speaking. Then she walked with him toward the front of the aircraft, and as she passed the man in the pale blue shirt, she heard him mutter something under his breath, something that contained the phrase, "I had a feeling," and she looked straight ahead and kept walking. Behind her, someone she never found out who began to applaud. It was quiet at first, just one pair of hands, and then a second joined in, tentative, and then less so. She walked off the plane to the soft percussion of strangers clapping for her removal. The room they brought her to was a standard airport security holding area. Not a cell, not an interrogation room, but a small beige space with plastic chairs, a table bolted to the wall, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. There were 2 other airport security personnel present when Maya was escorted in, and they looked at her with the careful blankness of people who had been told very little. Agent Callahan had not handcuffed her, had not read her any rights, had not told her she was under arrest because she was not under arrest. She was being held for questioning on the basis of an unspecified security concern, which is a bureaucratic designation with enough legal ambiguity to be used quite broadly. Maya sat in one of the plastic chairs and placed her laptop bag on her knees and looked at her hands. A junior officer asked if she wanted water. She said yes, not because she was thirsty, but because she needed something to hold. The water came in a paper cup, the kind that collapses slightly under pressure. Maya held it with both hands and sat very still, and told herself, in the interior voice she used, for the moments when she needed to function through something unbearable, that she had been here before. Not in this exact room, not on this exact day, but in this situation, in this experience, in this specific flavoring of public humiliation dressed up in institutional language. She had been here before, and she had survived it before, and she would survive it again. The boarding pass in her bag was perfectly valid. Her passport was in order. Her name appeared on no watch list. She had committed no crime, violated no rule, and posed no threat. The only thing she had done was sit in a first class seat while being a black woman, and someone, a passenger, she would soon confirm had found that sufficiently alarming to report. It took approximately 45 minutes before anyone told her what had actually happened. The person who eventually explained it to her was not Agent Callahan. It was a young man named Derek, who worked in the airline's passenger services division, and whose unofficial function, on this afternoon, appeared to be cleaning up a situation that was becoming rapidly more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Derek was 26 years old, nervous in a specific way that suggested he had recently understood something about his workplace that he wished he had not, and he came into the holding room, carrying a thin folder and a look that was part apology and part institutional caution. He sat across from Maya and told her, in careful language, that a first class passenger had submitted a verbal complaint to a gate agent approximately 20 minutes before boarding, expressing concern that a woman matching Maya's description appeared to be, in the passenger's words, out of place in the premium cabin. There had been no specific accusation, no allegation of criminal behavior, no indication of threat. The gate agent had relayed the complaint to the security coordination desk, which had dispatched Agent Callahan to investigate, and Agent Callahan had, in the interest of what he would later describe as an abundance of caution, asked Maya to leave her seat. Derek said the word caution with the careful inflection of someone who had been coached to use neutral language, but Maya heard what it was. The complaint had been, "This woman does not look like she belongs here." The response had been, "Remove her." No verification, no investigation, no threshold of evidence whatsoever. Just a subjective assessment by a fellow passenger. A passenger who had never spoken to Maya, who knew nothing about her, who had formed a judgment based entirely on the way she looked, and a security official who had acted on it as though it were a credible report. Maya listened to Derek without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Is my flight still boarding?" Derek said he was not sure. Maya said, "I'd like to call my father." The conversation was brief. Maya dialed a number she had only recently committed to memory. She had kept it written on a note card inside her laptop bag for the first 2 years after they had reconnected, not yet trusting herself to remember it, not yet fully believing the reconciliation was real. The phone rang twice. A man's voice answered deep, unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned over many decades to be the stillest person in any room. "Maya," he said. She said, "Dad." A beat of silence. She told him where she was. She told him what had happened calmly, precisely, in the same measured tone she used in board meetings, because falling apart would require energy she did not currently have. Her father, whose full name was Harold Raymond Johnson, and who had spent the last 26 years building one of the most significant aviation investment portfolios in North America, listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Harold Johnson said, "Are you all right?" Maya said yes. Harold said, "Are you physically safe?" Maya said yes. Harold said, "Good. Stay where you are. I'm going to handle this." There was a quality to his voice that she had first noticed 2 years ago, when they had spent an awkward but increasingly honest weekend in Boston, trying to rebuild something across the distance of nearly 3 decades. It was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more absolute than anger. The voice of a man who had learned that the most effective expression of power was restraint. Maya said, "Dad, you don't have to." Harold Johnson said, "I know I don't have to, but I'm going to." He hung up. Maya sat in the plastic chair with the collapsed paper cup and listened to the fluorescent lights hum above her head. In the hallway outside, a cart went by with a squeaky wheel. Somewhere distant, a child was crying. The world continued to function in its ordinary way, while her father, 9 time zones partially away at a business dinner in Chicago, reached into his jacket pocket and began making calls. Harold Raymond Johnson was not a famous man in the way that technology founders or celebrity executives were famous. He was famous in a different register, the kind of famous that exists in specific rooms among specific people, the kind that does not require a publicist or a verified account or a profile in a consumer magazine. He was known in boardrooms, in regulatory offices, in the glass towers where major financial decisions about infrastructure and transportation were made. At 61 years old, Harold Johnson was the founder and chief executive of Apex Capital Aviation Partners, a private investment firm that held substantial equity positions in 7 commercial airlines, 3 regional carriers, 3 major airport management companies, and a constellation of ancillary aviation businesses ranging from fuel distribution to ground handling. His firm had, over the previous decade, made several pivotal investments that had restructured the financial architecture of the American commercial aviation sector. He sat on the boards of 2 of the airlines whose tickets ordinary people bought every day without knowing his name. Transatlantic Airways, the carrier from which his daughter had just been removed at the request of a prejudiced passenger and a careless federal agent, was one of them. Harold Johnson had held his board seat at Transatlantic for 6 years. He had never used it for personal reasons. In all of his time on that board, he had never once called the airline's chief executive to discuss a personal matter. He made that call now. The Transatlantic CEO, a man named Patrick Hargrove, who was at that moment preparing for a dinner reservation in Manhattan, answered his personal cell phone to find Harold Johnson on the other end of the line, speaking in a tone that Hargrove would later tell colleagues made every subsequent sentence feel like the closing paragraph of a very long legal document. Harold described the situation. He described it completely and without embellishment. He said, "I want to know what happened. I want to know why it happened, and I want it corrected tonight." Then he called 2 additional members of the Transatlantic board. Then he called the firm's general counsel. Within 35 minutes of Maya's phone call, the senior leadership structure of Transatlantic Airways had been set in motion with the specific and urgent task of understanding how a first-class passenger had been removed from a flight on the basis of a subjective complaint from another passenger with no investigation, no evidence, and no procedural justification of any kind. The footage from the gate cameras and the aircraft's internal CCTV system was reviewed within the hour. What the review team saw was, by any professional standard, damning. They watched Maya Johnson board the aircraft with a valid first-class boarding pass. They watched her take her seat, without incident, without confrontation, without any behavior that could reasonably be described as suspicious or disruptive. They watched a gate agent receive a verbal complaint from a male passenger, later identified as a 53-year-old financial consultant named Warren Stiles, who pointed toward the boarding gate and said, something that the camera's audio system partially captured. They watched the complaint be relayed, without meaningful evaluation, to the security desk. They watched Agent Callahan enter the aircraft. They watched Maya be escorted off. They watched Warren Stiles remain in his first-class seat unmolested for the duration of the boarding process, buckle his seatbelt, and accept a pre-departure beverage. The legal team's preliminary assessment, delivered to CEO Patrick Hargrove at approximately 9:45 that evening, was precise and unambiguous. The airline had removed a paying first-class passenger based on an unverified subjective complaint that contained no articulable security basis whatsoever, had failed to follow its own non-discrimination protocols, had potentially violated federal civil rights statutes, and had done so in a manner that was captured on camera, witnessed by dozens of passengers, and had already begun circulating on the internet in at least 3 separate video formats. Hargrove called Harold Johnson back at 10 past 10. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, Hargrove called his head of operations and told him to hold Flight 714 on the ground. The aircraft had been preparing for a delayed pushback. The boarding drama had already cost the flight 45 minutes when the order came through from operations to stand down. The captain received it in the cockpit and acknowledged it without visible emotion, as pilots are trained to do with instructions that fall outside normal parameters. The passengers in the cabin felt the subtle shift of an aircraft that was done pretending to move the particular stillness of engines idling with nowhere to go. Rumors began circulating immediately among the 147 passengers, several of whom had witnessed the removal of the woman in seat 2A, and most of whom had, by now, heard some version of it from those who had. Warren Stiles, the man who had initiated the complaint, sat in his seat with a carefully arranged expression of inconvenience. He did not know, yet, that his name had been identified. In the security holding area, a new person had arrived, a woman named Sandra Kelly, who was Transatlantic's Director of Passenger Relations, and who had driven to the airport herself after receiving a call from the executive office that she later described as the most concerning professional communication she had received in 15 years with the company. Sandra sat across from Maya and said, "Miss Johnson, I am deeply sorry for what has happened. I want to assure you that this situation is being taken with the utmost seriousness at the highest levels of this company." Maya looked at her and said, "That's reassuring to hear, but I'd like to understand what happens next." Sandra said, "There is currently an investigation underway. The flight has been held." Maya said, "The entire flight?" Sandra nodded. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The other passengers didn't do anything wrong." Sandra said, "No, they didn't, and we will address that. But right now, our priority is making sure that what happened to you is properly understood and properly addressed." In the next room, Agent Roy Callahan was sitting across from two transatlantic senior managers and the airline's in-house legal counsel, answering questions about his decision-making process with the growing awareness of a person who has realized, too late, that the ground beneath them has changed. The investigation that unfolded over the following 72 hours was comprehensive in a way that institutional investigations rarely are, precisely because the financial and reputational stakes were so unambiguously high. Agent Callahan was interviewed by the airline's legal team, by the Transportation Security Administration's Internal Affairs Division, and by the Federal Aviation Administration's Civil Rights Compliance Office, all of which had been notified in rapid succession following Hargrove's initial response. His account of the incident remained consistent. He had received a second-hand report of a concern, he had assessed the situation, he had decided to err on the side of caution. He had not, he acknowledged, asked to see Maya's identification before approaching her. He had not accessed her passenger profile. He had not cross-referenced her name with any security database. He had simply walked up to a black woman seated in first class and told her there was a security concern and asked her to leave. The phrase, "err on the side of caution," appeared in his account 7 times. The legal team noted it each time. Warren Stiles was interviewed separately, and his account had the quality of something that had been partially revised in the hours since the event. He said he had not meant to imply that Maya was dangerous. He said he had simply thought it was unusual that someone of her, and here he paused, for a notably long moment apparent background, was seated in first class without any accompanying companions. The pause was noted. The phrase apparent background was noted. The flight attendant who had checked Maya's boarding pass twice gave a statement that was apologetic in tone, and notable for what it did not say. She never quite articulated why she had checked the boarding pass a second time, when no other passengers had been checked even once. The picture that assembled itself from these interviews was not complicated. It was, in fact, depressingly legible. A black woman had taken a first-class seat. A white passenger had decided that was improbable. An airline employee had deferred to that judgment without investigation. A federal agent had acted on it without verification. And the resulting humiliation had been public, documented, and entirely without procedural justification. Within 4 days of the incident, Transatlantic Airways had suspended Agent Callahan pending a full TSA review, issued formal written apologies to Maya Johnson, that ran to 3 pages and had been reviewed by 3 lawyers before being sent, placed Warren Styles on its internal no-fly registry, initiated mandatory retraining for all gate staff who had been involved, and commissioned an independent audit of its non-discrimination complaint procedures. CEO Patrick Hargrove had called Maya personally, not through an intermediary, not through legal counsel, but personally to apologize in terms that Maya's own attorney later described as among the most direct and substantive she had heard from an executive in a discrimination case. The airline had also, quietly, made clear its willingness to discuss a settlement. Maya had listened to all of this and had said, with characteristic directness, she was not interested in a settlement. She was not interested in money, not from them. She was interested in one thing: a concrete, enforceable, independently audited commitment that every employee who might find themselves in a position to make decisions affecting passengers would receive meaningful anti-bias training within the following 12 months. Hargrove had agreed before she finished the sentence. The media attention was significant and arrived with the speed that only a combination of multiple bystander videos, a sympathetic subject, and an identifiable institutional villain can produce. The story appeared on the front page of 2 major newspapers. It was the lead item on 3 national evening newscasts. A legal analyst on one cable network described the airline's procedural failures as a textbook example of how bias gets laundered through institutional language. Several former flight attendants gave interviews describing a culture within the industry in which the assumed profile of a first-class passenger remained, in practice, deeply racialized, regardless of official policy language. Maya gave one interview a long-form piece for a national publication in which she spoke carefully and without rancor about what had happened, what it meant, and what she hoped would change. She did not name her father in the interview. She did not mention his role in initiating the investigation. She had asked him not to make the story about him, and he had agreed. And the fact that he had agreed without argument had meant more to her than she had words for. The question of Harold Johnson and his daughter was, in some ways, the quieter story, running beneath the louder one, the story that the public did not fully know and that Maya was still, in the months following the incident, in the process of understanding herself. Harold had left when Maya was 4. The reasons, she had learned as an adult, were more complicated than simple abandonment. There had been a combination of circumstances involving a failed business, a mental health crisis, that had gone unaddressed. Because in that community, in that era, men did not address such things, and a decision that he had convinced himself, wrongly and with consequences that would take 25 years to fully reckon with, was somehow protective. He had sent money irregularly through Maya's childhood, never enough, never accompanied by explanation. There had been birthday cards for the first 3 years, then nothing. Then, when Maya was 17 and had won a statewide science competition, and her photo appeared in the local paper, a handwritten letter arrived at their apartment, no return address, 4 sentences, signed only H. Diane had given it to her daughter without comment. Maya had read it once, folded it in half, and put it in a shoebox under her bed. She had not answered it. She had not told anyone about it for a long time. He had rebuilt his life, in the years that followed, in ways that, from the outside, looked like remarkable success, and from the inside, he had described to Maya, in a hotel bar in Boston 2 years ago, felt like a debt he was never sure he could repay. The Boston meeting had been arranged by a mutual acquaintance, a family lawyer who had handled Diane's estate after a health scare that had turned out to be less serious than feared, but which had nonetheless prompted a series of conversations about unfinished business. Maya had agreed to meet Harold with the specific intention of telling him that she did not need anything from him and had not needed anything from him for a very long time. That was, more or less, what she said. He had listened, ordered a second drink he did not touch, and said, "I know. I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here because I was wrong, and I owe you the acknowledgement that I was wrong, and I understand if that acknowledgement means nothing to you at this point." She had looked at him across the bar table, this tall man with gray at his temples and her own eyes, and felt something shift inside her that she could not immediately name. It was not forgiveness, not then. Forgiveness would take longer and arrive quietly, the way certain seasons do, without announcing themselves. Their reconciliation had been slow and effortful, and characterized by the specific difficulty of two people who are each, in different ways, unaccustomed to vulnerability, trying to build something real. Maya had spent the first year of their renewed contact testing the boundaries of his reliability in small ways, calling at inconvenient times, asking favors she could easily have handled herself, waiting to see if he would show up or disappear. He had shown up, every time, quietly, without performance, without the self congratulation of a man who thought showing up made him a hero. He had simply shown up. And when she called him from that beige room with the fluorescent lights and the collapsed paper cup, the first thing he had asked was not how he could help or what he could do. The first thing he had asked was whether she was all right. That had mattered. It had mattered in a way that lived in her chest for a long time afterward. The program that Transatlantic Airways implemented in the months following the incident became, within the industry, a reference point. The Anti-Bias Training Initiative, developed in partnership with 3 civil rights organizations, 2 behavioral psychologists, and a working group of current airline employees who had themselves experienced discrimination in the workplace, was rolled out across 11,000 staff members over a period of 10 months. It was not the box-checking exercise that such programs often became. Maya had insisted, in the terms she negotiated with the airline, that the training include follow-up assessments, that the results be reported to an independent oversight body, and that disciplinary consequences for documented bias incidents be clearly defined and consistently applied. She had also insisted that the training include a specific module on the particular dynamics of first-class cabin bias, the set of assumptions that led ordinary, non-malicious people to experience a cognitive jolt when the demographics of a premium space did not match their internal model of who belonged there. The airline had accepted all of these terms. In the internal communications that circulated among Transatlantic's senior leadership in those months, the incident was referred to only as the Heathrow situation, a careful bit of institutional euphemism that gave away, by its very caution, how seriously the company understood the damage that had been done. A new passenger complaint review protocol was drafted that required any security-related removal from a cabin to be documented, justified with specific articulable facts, and signed off by a senior operations manager before it could be executed. Warren Stiles, the financial consultant who had initiated the complaint, received a formal letter notifying him of his placement on the airline's no-fly registry. His name appeared in no public reporting. Maya had not named him and had instructed her legal team not to either, but several of the people who had been present on the aircraft that day recognized his description in the news. Coverage and his professional reputation suffered consequences that, while unplanned, were not entirely undeserved. The TSA, observing the situation, opened its own review of Air Marshal deployment protocols and commissioned a study on the demographic patterns of voluntary removals from commercial aircraft over the previous 5 years. The results of that study, when they became available, were not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. They were, however, sufficiently stark that they could no longer be officially ignored. 8 months after Flight 714 was held on the ground at Heathrow Airport, Maya Johnson stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C. At the National Aviation Industry Forum, an annual gathering of airline executives, regulators, industry analysts, and policy professionals that was not typically known for its emotional moments. She had been invited to give the keynote address. She had accepted. She had written the speech herself and had not let anyone review it in advance, which had made the forum's communications director quietly nervous in the weeks leading up to the event, and which Maya had found, privately, a little amusing. The invitation itself had been significant. She was the first black woman to deliver the keynote at the forum in its 23-year history. The fact that it had taken 23 years for this to happen was not lost on her, and she had decided, after some reflection, not to mention it in her address. It did not need to be said. The room would understand it without being told. She wore a deep navy suit and a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother, who had died of a stroke the previous spring, a loss that had arrived in the middle of everything and added a layer of grief to what had already been a transformative year. Diane Johnson had lived long enough to see her daughter's picture in the newspaper. She had called Maya when the story broke and said, in the dry, knowing voice she had never lost, "Baby, I raised you for exactly this." Maya had laughed and cried at the same time. She kept the memory of that phone call in a place she returned to when she needed steadying. She spoke for 31 minutes. She spoke about the incident at Heathrow, not as a story of personal injury, but as a case study in the way institutional systems absorb individual bias and convert it into official action, giving it the weight and legitimacy of procedure. She spoke about what it felt like to be sitting in a seat you had paid for and worked for and earned by every reasonable measure, and to still be made to feel like a question mark in your own life. She spoke about the specific exhaustion of spending decades navigating a world that made you prove yourself continuously, at every threshold, in every room, to a standard that was never applied to the person standing next to you. She spoke about her mother. She spoke, briefly and with careful restraint, about her father, about what it meant to have someone in your corner who acted not because it was easy or convenient, but because you were his, and the situation was wrong, and there was simply no other acceptable response. She did not cry. She had decided before she walked up to that podium that she would not cry, not because emotion was weakness, but because she wanted every person in that room to hear every word with full clarity, undistracted by the performance of feeling. In the front row, Harold Johnson sat in a charcoal suit, with his hands folded in his lap, and watched his daughter speak. He had flown in the night before from Chicago and had dinner with her at a quiet restaurant near the hotel, where they had talked about everything except the speech, about the fall weather, about a book he had been reading, about a hiking trail in Vermont she had been meaning to try for 2 years. He had not asked what she was going to say, and she had not offered to tell him. There was, between them, a new kind of trust that did not require previewing or preparing. When she spoke about him at the podium briefly, without naming him, referring only to a father who had shown up at the right moment, Harold Johnson allowed himself to feel something that he had not permitted himself to feel for most of his adult life. Uncomplicated pride. Not pride in what he had built, not pride in his portfolio, or his board positions, or the particular kind of influence he had accumulated in rooms where most people's names were never spoken. Pride in her. Pride in the person she had become entirely on her own terms, in spite of his absence, in spite of everything, in spite of the morning in Columbus long ago, when he had walked out a door and told himself a lie that had taken 25 years to stop believing. She had built herself into this. The deals, the company, the keynote address, the 32-year-old woman standing at a podium in a navy suit with her mother's pearls and saying out loud to 1,100 people in a ballroom, and however many more beyond it, the things that needed to be said. He had provided one phone call. She had provided everything else. When Maya reached the final lines of her address, the room had gone very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they are listening with their full attention, and not merely their hearing. She paused for a moment, not for effect, but because she was, for a fraction of a second, back in that beige room with the fluorescent lights, holding a paper cup of water with both hands and deciding what kind of person she was going to be when this was over. Then she looked up from her notes and said, "Respect should not be conditional on the color of someone's skin, the cut of their clothing, or the balance of their bank account. It should not require proof. It should not need to be earned in the moment, in the airport, in the cabin, in the glance of a stranger who has decided before you have spoken a single word what category you belong to. Every person who moves through this world, through your airports, through your terminals, through your aircraft, deserves to be treated as a full human being from the first moment to the last. Not because they can afford a certain seat, not because they carry a certain name, but because they are a person. That is the only threshold that should matter. And if that seems radical to anyone in this room, I would ask you to sit with that feeling and ask yourself what it tells you." The applause began before she had finished the final syllable. It started in the middle rows and spread quickly to the edges, and within seconds had become the kind of standing ovation that is not performed or obligatory, but genuine. The sound of people responding to something that has named a truth they had been carrying without adequate language. Maya stood at the podium for a moment and let it wash over her, not with triumph, but with something quieter and more durable. Then she stepped back from the microphone, gathered her notes with steady hands, and walked off the stage. In the wings, a young woman from the conference staff handed her a bottle of water. Maya accepted it and said thank you, and stood in the dim space behind the curtain for just a moment, listening to the applause continue. She was not thinking about the airline or the lawsuit or the agent who had told her to leave her seat. She was thinking about her mother, pressing a church dress with a hot iron on Sunday mornings, humming gospel songs, and believing in a future her daughter had not yet grown into. She was thinking about a 4-year-old girl in Columbus who had decided, in the absence of anyone telling her she could, that she would build something worth the trouble. She was thinking that the woman who had walked off that aircraft at Heathrow in humiliation and the woman who had just walked off this stage were the same person, that the humiliation had not diminished her and the applause had not defined her, and the only measure that had ever mattered was the one she carried inside, the one nobody had given her and nobody could take away. She drank the water. She straightened her jacket. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into where someone had expected her to be smaller than she was, the computer science classrooms, the boardrooms, the funding meetings where the partner across the table had checked her credentials twice, while checking no one else's, the first class cabin at Heathrow, where a stranger had decided, in the space of a glance, that she did not belong. She had walked into every one of those rooms. She had stayed in every one of those rooms. She had done the work in every one of those rooms, and the work had spoken for itself in the only language that ultimately mattered, which was the language of results. She had never stopped to wait for permission to exist fully in any space she had earned the right to occupy, and she was not going to start now. She thought about Diane, who had pressed church dresses and hummed gospel songs, and worked double shifts, and told her daughter, in every possible form that love takes, that she was worth the whole world's trouble. She thought about the 4-year-old who had grown up not knowing her father's face and had built an identity without that anchor, and had been, against all the odds of circumstance and assumption, and the accumulated weight of other people's ceilings, entirely sufficient. She thought about all the women and men who looked like her and had been told, in airports and boardrooms and classrooms and 1,000 other places, that the space they had entered was not quite meant for them. She was not just standing in the wings of this stage for herself. She had never been doing any of this just for herself. And then she walked back out into the light, and the applause rose again to meet her. And she accepted it without flinching, not as a verdict, not as validation, but simply as the sound of people recognizing, together, something that had always been true.